So before we come to our today's content, before we talk about how to persuade others to change their attitudes, norms, and expectations, I would like to kind of take a step back and look at the bigger picture, look at what we have done so far and how this all fits into one kind of larger framework that won't be a perfect fit, but I think it will help you to have a feeling for each and every component, how these components fit together and how they can inform the interventions that you build. And I think it's always good to start with the theory of planned behavior or some of these equivalents. I think I always say it that the theory of planned behavior is just one idea, or one theory, arguably the most influential theory that kind of summarizes a large body of work that suggests that attitudes, norms, and expectations, here perceived control in the model called driving our intentions to behave in our behavior. And so often these are also called expectancy value theories, where you kind of like call the attitude a value, and here the perceived control and expectations. There are many different ways of looking at that, but all they come back again and again and again is that these three components, our attitudes, our norms, and our expectations, have a huge impact, at least on our intentions to act, but also on our behavior. So let's take that and see how we can use that framework to make a little bit sense of the things we did so far. And I want to kind of do something weird and not starting with the first week, but basically going back from today to the first week. So last week we talked about attitude change, right? So here we talked about this component. We focus on attitudes, right? That was our main focus. And the focus here was kind of like, why do people have negative attitudes towards other people that simply are not in their group, in their in-group, right? We had black and white Americans as our example because it's the most well-researched bit of this puzzle. But you can fill in like negative attitudes towards people just because of like different sexuality, different gender, different abilities or disabilities, and so forth, right? So attitude change in terms of other people. And what we kind of added to the theory of planned behavior is a little bit of complexity around attitudes, right? We saw that there are explicit and implicit attitudes. It's not that we just have simply attitudes that we can ask people and we want to change them, then we can simply see by asking them kind of like to change them. No, there are explicit and implicit attitudes. Both of them are important for our behavior. We kind of show that explicit attitudes are more strongly related to our intentional behavior, and implicit might be more strongly related to our spontaneous behavior under stress, where we have very little control, very little motivation or ability to control our behavior, right? This also highlights kind of like, okay, if we want to think about changing behavior, we have to also think about the situation it takes place. So what kind of behavior it is that we want to change? What is the key component to the problem we want to solve? And what's the situation it is taking place in? And that will also give us an idea how changing simply the attitude that then influences our intention, then our behavior, or maybe directly via the implicit route, how much chance does that actually have to change? So this is a really important component, right? Kind of an extension of that model, thinking about explicit and implicit attitudes, but also thinking about, okay, what are the constraints of the situations? What's the type of behavior we want to change? Is it something that's under deliberative control, or is it something that might be a little bit more automatic? So in a week before the reading week, we talked about why interventions fail, and we talked about the importance of psychological needs, right? So now it's again kind of like a look at attitudes. And I think some people say in the beginning, at least of social psychology about 100 years ago, that maybe social psychology is all about attitudes. And you can see here the importance of attitudes in the thinking that social psychologists have about behavior. And we have an extreme extreme focus on attitudes. But here it's like, I think it's a very different take. It's basically, okay, why do people have, for instance, negative attitudes towards performing a certain behavior? Might it be that it is related to failure to connect them to their really psychological needs, right? The importance of psychological needs. That's what we discussed in that week. And we kind of showed that it's important to say like, okay, if I want to have some change, some lasting change in the behavior of people, then I should not focus so much on kind of obvious surface incentives, but maybe I should focus more on deeper seated needs like autonomy, our intrinsic motivation, relatedness, a desire to grow, a desire for meaning. Okay. And I think we ended the session really nicely on kind of highlighting that we have a tendency, especially me, as I highlighted in the example, to dehumanize others, to think, okay, it's yes, psychological needs are important for me, but not for others. So here the lesson is not only to kind of consider these needs, but also kind of overcome your tendency to maybe neglect them, to downplay them, because we know from tons of research that these needs are really important, but we also know that people try to neglect them. It's like, oh, in our example, what homeless people really need is food. They don't need growth. They don't need social relatedness. But nothing could be further from the truth as we have seen. So it's important to kind of think about the needs people have. So it's not just attitudes. It's not basically why, like, oh, a person has a negative attitude towards this behavior. We have to change this attitude. One key lever for changing them is basically how the intention, how the behavior, and how the attitude is connected to the need. Okay, and that was basically an important lesson that we had in that week. In the week beforehand, I think we also talked about needs, but here we looked at wise intervention. We basically kind of started to look at this process where we design an intervention to persuade others to change their attitude, to change their norms, to change their control, with the desire to change their intention and then downstream obviously change their behavior. And here we said like, okay, it's not only that needs drive these kind of, in our everyday situations, the attitudes, the norms, and the control we perceive to have over the behavior, but it's also that needs underlie how we make sense of that persuasion process, right? For instance, remember when I'm trying to change the attitude or the beliefs that a low self-esteem person has about the appreciation of their partner for them, then I have to kind of think about, okay, it's not just the process of look, your partner really likes you, here's another compliment, but taking into account that maybe the meaning-making process might stand in the way of successfully persuading them. So how can I use these needs, these meaning for belonging and the need for kind of like a positive self-regard, how can I use them in the persuasion process itself? How can I connect my intervention in a way that will make it more likely that I persuade them to change these components? So it's almost like we step a little bit back. We said, yes, attitudes, norms, and control are really important. Needs are really important for these three components, but it's also the same is true for the intervention itself and how people make sense of it, right? So if somebody comes to me, I think if you remember that example and says like, kind of sends me a certain message and it's like, Andreas, you need to, here's an intervention that will help you to be more productive at work, and it's all about planning your time or something like that. I think that's a terrible example, but I would immediately say like, okay, this person doesn't understand. It's not that I badly plan my time. It is not that I do not want to do more. It's just that I simply don't have the time, and a different intervention would make sense. So I'm trying immediately to kind of understand what a certain message tells me about the picture the other person has of me. And this is the importance of kind of figuring out the needs that not only influence our behavior in everyday life, but also the persuasion process, right? The intervention, because the intervention is a persuasion trying to change your norms, attitudes, and your expectations in order to change behavior. So how can we think about this persuasion process? So this It's exactly what we're doing today. We're kind of focusing on the persuasion process, and we're trying to see, okay, what are specific techniques that for attitudes, for changing norms or perceived norms, and for changing perceived expectations. One thing, I mean, we talked about some of these techniques already, and I think I will kind of mention them on the things that we already talked about. But what we want to do is focusing on the social dimension, which reconnects us to the very first session here, because we think as social psychologists that attitudes, norms, and control, that the needs that underlie that the intervention itself has a really strong social foundation. We have to take that social foundation into account in order to design really effective interventions. Just to give you a little bit like a heads up for what is going to happen in the 2 weeks thereafter. Next week, we'll talk about the so-called behavior intention gap. So often if we have an intention, we really want to change our behavior. We have really strong attitudes, check. We have great norms, check. And we have really strong expectations. And somehow, sometimes people fail to then build a strong intention. And this is often called crossing the Rubicon. So we talk a little bit about how we can help people to commit to a goal, how we can help them to commit to actually take action, to form an intention. We also talk briefly about how this changes how people perceive themselves and others once they cross the Rubicon. This is this river here. I will explain in the coming week why it's called the Rubicon, and some might already heard, some might be familiar with Heckhausen and Gollwitzer's Rubicon model of behavioral control. But this is basically, then we talk about here, this gap, that because this connection between the intention and the behavior is not that strong. Even people have strong intention often fail to act on it. And how can we kind of increase that? And this is the realm of self-control here, where we kind of think about strategies that help people to act in ways they already want to act in. Okay, we talk briefly also a little bit about this, how we can increase feedback monitoring in order to increase the behavior they have. And then in the last one, we talk a little bit about what I here kind of call symbolize with a magic hats, a little bit the tricks of nudges, which I think sometimes call scratching on the surface, and when this might be a good idea to use a nudge, and why nudges often fail to kind of lead to lasting behavior change. So this is the program for today. This is the program for the next 2 weeks, and I hope you enjoy the upcoming chapters.